We are continuing our study in Revelation chapter 14. The title of tonight's study is The Interlude. We've had other interludes in Revelation before. Once we have another interlude. The interlude, the 144,000, the three angels, and the harvest. Revelation 14, 1 through 20. Listen as I read this entire chapter from the NRSV. Then I looked, and there was a lamb standing on Mount Zion. And with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and for the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." Then another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Then another angel, a third, followed them, crying with a loud voice, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. This is the written word of the Lord. Okay, so what are our initial thoughts? What stands out to you in this chapter? There's quite a bit going on here.
There is judgment.
There's judgment.
And separation from the faithful and the unfaithful.
Yes, the wicked and the faithful are separated. Yeah. There's judgment. What else stands out to you in this chapter? Number 144,000, and we'll talk about that. Does that sound familiar? We've read about the 144,000. We're hearing about them again. Yeah. Anything else?
The song that only the 144,000 could sing.
Yeah, the song that only 144,000 could sing. Once again, that sounds fairly familiar. We've read about the faithful singing these songs. We read about it earlier on in the book. Anything else that catches your attention? The sickle, yeah. And we'll talk about the use of the sickle, both for positive and negative purposes. Yeah. Have any of you seen someone harvest a field with a sickle? The old style sickles with a really sharp curved edge. I watched a lady mow a field with a sickle. It was incredible to watch. I watched it. There's a video online of it. You can watch somebody harvest a field with a sickle, and it's kind of a beautiful act. how they can do that, how they can harvest a field and mow down a field with this sickle.
That's what farmers did years and years ago.
And that's how they would harvest before these newfangled tractors, before this technology we have today. Yeah. And so we'll talk about the sickle, and we'll talk about that reaping and that harvesting and its positive and negative connotations. But let's go ahead and go through these. We've got a lot to discuss tonight. This is a longer chapter, and there's a lot of content here. So I have, according to my watch, 48 minutes. So we're gonna cruise along tonight. Starting at verse 1. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Where is the Lamb standing? On Mount Zion. This is important because we've been reading about various creatures positioned in various locations. If you remember from chapter 13, you remember you had a creature that came out of the sea, and then a creature that came out of the land. But here we have this creature that we know about. We've heard about this creature, the Lamb, right? Standing where? On Mount Zion. And Mount Zion was a place that was traditionally known as a safe haven for the faithful. Mount Zion was called in Jerusalem a safe place. It was a place of deliverance. And it was traditionally considered a place in Jerusalem. But here, where is Mount Zion described? It's in heaven right now. What we're seeing is a description of a heavenly reality. And so Mount Zion now is located in heaven. And so as we're looking up to heavenly things, one of the things to consider is to remember that this immediately follows chapter 13. What happened in chapter 13? What did we read about in chapter 13? Yeah, the anti-things, the mark of the beast. We read about the imitators, one who looked like God, one who looked like Christ, one who had a mortal wound, a death blow, but appeared to have been alive. That we read about the one who looked like a prophet. These weren't the real things, but they looked like the real things in order to drag people away from the real things. These were the anti-realities. And so last chapter, chapter 13, and this chapter, chapter 14, they're written in large part so that the reader understands that neutrality is impossible. You cannot be for the Lamb and the beast. Either or here. This is a separating. And so our attention is taken from these beasts that come up out of the earth and out of the sea. And then John says, then I looked to the heavenly place, and I saw the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, which is a traditionally safe place, a place of deliverance. And with him were how many? 144,000. Remember from chapter 7, who are these? Is the 144,000 a limiting number? No, what is it? It's the entirety of God's people. This is symbolic language. In chapter 7, we read about the 144,000. John heard, I heard a number, 144,000. Then I looked, and I saw a multitude that could not be counted. The 144,000 is a descriptor of the faithful, not a limited reality. It's not that there are only 144,000 people or Jews or 144,000 Jews that are saved. This number indicates the entirety of the faithful. And how are they described? What was the symbol that they had? They had a name written on their foreheads. Does that sound familiar? From chapter 13, what was the designating symbol from chapter 13? I heard somebody whisper it. 666. What is 666? It's the mark of the beast. And you remember at the end of chapter 13, it is a man's number. It is a name. And remember we talked about how this is very likely the name of Nero. The reader would associate this with empire. It was the name of the Satan. The unfaithful received the mark of the beast. This was the anti-mark. And now in chapter 14, we read of the faithful, the 144,000, the entirety of the people of God who also receive a mark. But what is this mark? It's also a name, isn't it?
The name of God.
It's the name of
The Father.
the Lamb and the Father. It's the name of God. They received the Lamb's name and his Father's name. Written where? On their foreheads. Well, here it's written on their foreheads. The mark of the beast is on the foreheads or the hand. Can you hide something that's written on your forehead? Not very well. This is an identifier. If it's written, if it's written on your forehead, people see it. It's obvious. For decades, people have fretted and made a loud stink about the mark of the beast. For those of you who were, who were following Christ in the mid-20th century, in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, how often did you hear about the mark of the beast? That was very present in Christian eschatology, the doctrine of the end times. How often did you hear about the mark of the Lamb?
I don't think that often.
Not as often. We've made a lot of noise about the mark of the beast, but you almost never hear about the mark of the Lamb. But guess what? The mark of the Lamb is the real mark. It's the thing that really matters.
Did you say it's on the forehead?
It's on the forehead. Yeah, it says it's on the forehead in verse 1 there. The Lamb's name and the Father's name were written on their foreheads. This is the mark that truly matters. This is the mark that marks you as a Christ follower. One either bears the mark of the Lamb or the mark of the beast. You can't have both. You cannot worship both lamb and beast. And this might sound obvious to us. For Christians in the 21st century, this might be really obvious. Christians in North America in the 21st century, this might be obvious. This singular fidelity or the singular faithfulness that we talked about this morning. But many in those Asian cities, remember this was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor from chapter 2, many in those Asian cities would have found it ridiculous to profess exclusive loyalty to God and the Lamb when one could be much more comfortable by joining in the practices of wider society. Because remember, one could not buy or sell without the mark of the beast. You couldn't participate in these guilds, in these economic practices of the ancient Roman Empire if you didn't worship the emperor. And so for those in Asia Minor who were reared on this polytheistic theology, this theology of many gods, to pledge your allegiance and worship solely to one God would have been foreign to them. But here, John is writing to those who have been reared in this culture that, hey, you cannot worship the Lamb and the beast. Those are competing realities. You either bear the mark of the beast or you bear the mark of the Lamb. And what we're seeing is you want to have the mark of the Lamb. That will become evident later on in this chapter. So then John writes, and I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they sing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. Where are we now? Where do the 4 living creatures and the elders reside? The throne room. We have been taken back. Our eyes look all the way back to the throne room. They sing a new song. Does that sound familiar? This once again is heavenly worship. This is what the faithful do. They're in perpetual worship, and their eyes are always fixed on the throne room. Their eyes are always fixed on the Lamb. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. Only those who have been redeemed worship God. This is saying those who are faithful are the ones who are redeemed. This is emphasizing. It is these, here, this gets fun. This gets fun, doesn't it? It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Well, hold on a second. Are faithful people virgins? Is this saying, if we're going to have a literal understanding of Revelation, which is what some people argue for, does this mean that faithful people abstain from sex? Does this mean that if you are going to be a faithful person, you have to be a virgin?
No. But you have to be pure.
Yeah, so what do we do with this? Because obviously, John is not saying that in order to be faithful, you have to abstain for your entire life. And you have to be a virgin all the time. Because don't forget about other images of faithful people. In chapter 12, we read about the pregnant woman who bore a son and who had many other children. And that woman was an identifier of the complete faithful people. Well, if you're going to bear a child, you have not abstained. This is imagery for the faithful. It's not exclusively you have to abstain, you have to only be a virgin. Then later on in chapter 19, the faithful will be described as a bride on her wedding day. One who is not abstaining from sexual activity. So we need to be careful not to draw these lines and to take this absolutely literally. Why would John call them virgins? Well, Solveig, you've mentioned purity. Why else? Well, according to Deuteronomy and according to 1 Samuel, the story of David and Uriah, if you remember that story, warriors were to abstain from sex. According to Deuteronomy, warriors, while they were in battle, would abstain. And if you remember from David and Uriah, David got Uriah's wife pregnant and brought Uriah home from battle so that he could get Uriah to lay with his wife so that David wouldn't be caught in this act. But Uriah, the faithful that he was, said, hey, I'm in war. And according to Deuteronomy, I don't have sex while we are at war. So he was following the ancient tradition. So one of the things we could say is that the 144,000 are these non-violent warriors for the kingdom. Because they are those who don't wield the sword. They're the ones who are taken by the sword. They're these warriors for the kingdom. But perhaps, and maybe this is more so the reality, this could be a bit of foreshadowing. This could be looking forward in Revelation. John could be perking our ears up about some stuff that he's going to be saying later on. Because remember, Revelation is not linear. It doesn't begin here and end here with a pretty linear story. That's not how John writes. It's cyclical. It retells these things over and over again. And later on in the text, we're going to read about Babylon. We're going to read about Babylon in this chapter, but then we're going to read about Babylon even more. And we're going to read about the great harlot. We're going to read about the people who have fornicated with the harlot. The faithful are those that have not fornicated with this harlot. Here, the virgins are those who follow the Lamb and reject the practices that are associated with God's adversaries. So this is fidelity. This is faithfulness, purity, and perhaps a bit of foreshadowing that the faithful do not fornicate with the great harlot that we will read about later on in the book. So let's be careful not to make everything that we read in Revelation literal. But these are described in order that we get an understanding. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits. Now, this indicates that this is just the beginning of the harvest. These are the first fruits. What are the first fruits? Is that the full crop? No, what are the first fruits? They're the first fruits, right? They're the first things to appear. They're an indicator that the harvest is near. They're not the full harvest. So later on in this chapter, we're going to read about a full harvest from the earth. But here we're reading about the first fruits for God and for the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless. Then, starting in verse 6, I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven. Now this is an interesting place. Where's mid-heaven?
Maybe between heaven and earth.
Maybe between heaven and earth. I think that's a very good guess. And in my research, I can't find a specific designation for mid-heaven, but perhaps we're seeing the space between heaven and earth, so that inhabitants both of heaven and earth hear what is being described. Because what's going to happen later on in the chapter? Who are going to wield these sickles? Angels. And angels reside where? In heaven. And where do they wield the sickles? On earth. So here we're kind of seeing, our eyes have been focused on the throne room, right? The four creatures and the elders. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven. Our attention is brought down a little bit to that space in between heaven and earth. And our gaze will be fixed here, where angels will wield these sickles on the earth. So I think, yes, Sylvia, I think it is that space between heaven and earth. Mid-heaven. The history of that term is, I think what we're seeing is that space where heaven and earth are united. Because these realities are going to be affecting one another in just a few verses, if that makes sense. With an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth. What generation is this gospel for? Every generation. This is a gospel for the 21st century, or this is a gospel for the 2nd century. Is that what he writes? This is an eternal gospel. Every generation are to heed these words. This gospel is for every time period. To proclaim to whom? Who shouldn't hear this gospel? Who should not hear it?
Everyone should hear it.
No one should not hear it. Right? To proclaim it to whom? To those who live on the earth. Who doesn't live on the earth? Raise your hand if you don't live on the earth. Or if you know someone who doesn't live on the earth. Or if you have ever known anyone who hasn't lived on the earth. Well, we don't yet have space travel. So, as of yet, this is for every human. Those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. This gospel is for everyone. This is not for just a select few. This angel has a gospel, an eternal gospel, every generation, throughout all time. And everyone who lives on the earth, all space and time are contained within this. You can't get a more widespread reality than an eternal gospel that is for everyone who lives on the earth. You just can't get any bigger. So he said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water." What is the content of this first angel's loud cry? What are people to do? Fear God. Give God glory. Worship him. This is a call to follow the Lord. This is
The last moment, God gives them an opportunity
absolutely.
to change their mind.
What's the point of this? Conversion rather than destruction. God is always wanting to provide a way for people to be redeemed. Conversion rather than destruction is God's desire. Now, we're going to read of destruction and judgment later on in the chapter. There are these three angels that speak, but what does the first angel speak? Follow God. Worship God. It's going to get real bad real quick. But the first thing we read of is God's desire, God's love, God's wanting people to be brought in. God doesn't first desire destruction, but God first desires redemption. God always desires redemption. And God wants all people to heed this warning, to follow God, to worship God. But God will not impose God's love on others. God loves in such a way that it is not an imposed thing. God won't force God's love on people. If any should doubt fearing God, we read that God is the one who created what? Worship the one who made heaven and earth, And what else?
See.
The sea and the springs of water. Now, two of these sound familiar, don't they? Do you remember from chapter 13? Where did the beasts come out of? The earth and the sea. But here we read of God who did what? Who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. We read of the beasts coming up out of the sea and from the earth last chapter. They sprung forth from creation. They came out of creation. Here, we read of the one who created the sea and the earth. So you're reading this, who is greater? The ones who came forth from creation or the one who created creation? The creator. There's no question who is the greatest. There's no doubt. The beasts are only an imitation, and they spring forth out of the sea and out of the earth, but God is the one who created the sea and the earth. There is no comparison about the greatness between the beasts and between God and the Lamb. Then another angel, a second. Here we have the second angel speaking. The second angel followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." Well, where did this come from? Where did Babylon come from? We haven't been reading about Babylon yet. This is out of place. If Revelation is a linear text, this is in the wrong place because we haven't heard anything about Babylon yet. And all of a sudden, John writes, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." But once again, this is foreshadowing. This is getting us ready for what he's going to be describing, because in chapters 17 and 18, we're going to read about Babylon. We're going to read a lot about Babylon. But we don't know anything about Babylon yet. What do we know about Babylon? According to verse 8 of chapter 14, what do we know? That it's great, but how great is it? What has happened to Babylon? It's fallen.
Well, yeah, because God did use Babylon to turn the people of Judah back to him, but then Babylon was destroyed.
Right. And so you have to, one of my New Testament professors who taught this course at Nazarene Theological Seminary, he would often say, you're not allowed to read the book of Revelation until you've read the 65 books prior. You're not, because it builds so much on the Old and New Testament. You have to understand what is happening. So for those who are familiar with Jewish history, Babylon triggers something. But when you're reading through Revelation, you've not heard anything about Babylon. All we read about Babylon thus far, according to John's purpose, is that Babylon has fallen. All we know is that Babylon the Great has fallen. But we haven't even read about Babylon rising to power. We haven't read about Babylon doing anything. Why would John include this now? Why would we read about fallen Babylon now?
Part of the judgment, Babylon represents the evil,
Babylon represents the wicked.
and so it's fallen.
Mm-hmm.
So the angel said this is part of the judgment. It's
Right. So Babylon the Great, should you be tempted to follow Babylon, what do you know about Babylon before you know anything about Babylon? What do you know? It's fallen. Before we even read about Babylon and her power, we read that Babylon is fallen. Knowing that Babylon is doomed to fail should make readers wary of placing any confidence in the city, even before they're told what Babylon is. We're not told how Babylon functions in the book of Revelation at all yet. All we know is that Babylon falls. So before we read anything else, the one thing we know is that she's doomed. Knowing that Babylon is doomed to fail should make anyone wary of placing any confidence in this city. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Here we're beginning to see these competing images. We read about the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth, the first fruits. And then now we read of Babylon, who is described as what? Drinking the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So we're seeing these imageries, the first fruits and then the wine. And these are important when we get later on in the chapter. Once we get into the verses 14 or 17 through 20, specifically 14 through 20, these images will become important. It will all tie together. Then another angel, here we go, the third angel, followed them crying with a loud voice. And before we read again what this angel is saying, this is one of the most difficult proclamations we read in the entire book. This is some very harsh language, and that could incite fear. When people often think of Revelation, they think of a scary book, and this might be one of the reasons, because this can sound pretty scary. But John writes, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive the mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. And they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name." Now, have you guys heard the argument that alcohol in the Old Testament, alcohol in Bible times was so diluted, wine was so diluted that there was almost no alcoholic content to the wine, and that they drank wine because water wasn't potable? Well, scholars have kind of put that one to rest, that the argument that there wasn't alcoholic content to the wine in Jesus' day. And in fact, have found out that it was such a high, it was so potent that they had to dilute it so that you could drink it. It had so much alcohol content that it was so strong that you had to dilute it. But what do we read here? The wine of God's wrath is poured. Is it mixed? Is it diluted? No. This is straight. They are drinking this wine, this incredibly potent wine, without any mixer. This is an unmixed libation, so it does not go down smoothly, is what you can read. So how do you respond to these words? What do we do with this? These are challenging words. Well, I think there are a couple different ways that people have responded to these words. The first is, as Craig Keister, this commentator that I've been reading, the first is that some interpret this as a weapon against their opponents. There are some who read this and say, yeah, this is God's judgment on the wicked. Yeah, this is people getting what they deserve. They say that this applies to others. Yeah, God's going to do this to those people, but it never applies to themselves. Yes, yet what we've seen throughout this is that self-righteousness is a form of self-deception that blinds people to their own sin. Some people have interpreted this passage with not much humility, thinking it's all about those evil people. You know who those evil people are. I know who they are. You know who they are. This is God's judgment on the people who deserve it. Get them, God. This kind of militant attitude. But one of the things we've read throughout Revelation is that failing to show love also incurs the wrath of God. Failing to show love incurs the wrath of God. So reading this with excitement about God condemning those we don't love is a bit incongruent. Does that make sense? It's a bit inappropriate and incompatible. To read this and say, yeah, this is God condemning those people, fails to have compassion or love for them. And what failing to show compassion does is incur the wrath of God.
Isn't it more of a warning?
Yeah, Martin, you're getting ahead of me here. Martin said, isn't this a bit of a warning? Hold on to that. Yeah. So one of the ways that we read this is, go get them, God. Go get those evil people. But then another is, we've got this notion of God, do not judge lest ye be judged, right? We read those passages from the Gospels and we think, well, if God tells us not to judge, then obviously God doesn't judge. But in those same Gospels, Jesus also talks about the separating of the sheep from the goats and the wheats from the tares. Another attitude is to dismiss this. Well, it's too uncomfortable. This sounds too vindictive. I don't know that I like this image of God. So therefore we ignore it. The truth is, though, that the Christian message is, it's judgment is an integral part of it. Judgment is a part of the Christian message. If we can't read this with delight, or if we can't dismiss it, what do we do?
Have compassion and concern for those that don't know God.
Have compassion and concern for those that don't love God. Yeah, and so how do we read this? Well, Martin, I think you hit it right on the head. Perhaps this vision of divine wrath is properly read as a warning. You see, warnings aren't given in order to make people despair of grace, but to bring about change, to avert disaster. Why do you warn someone of something? So that they don't hurt themselves, so that they don't kill themselves. Last week on Thursday, I wrote my sermon in Saugatuck. When I write my sermons, I oftentimes get out of town. I get away from distractions. I get away from my office and all the work I should do at home or the work I should do in the office, and I have to get away to write. And so I went to Saugatuck, and I spent all day in Saugatuck. And I brought my dog Aldo with me. We had a good time, and I wrote my sermon, and he sat on my lap, and he edited it for me. So he sits on my lap, and he says, "No, you missed that. You need to correct that." But so wrote my sermon, and at one point I was sitting on the patio of a restaurant when I was eating dinner, and he was sitting next to me, and I was eating, and a lady was walking across the street, and Aldo just instinctively, he's so fast, he shot out before I had any chance of catching him, and instinctively I hollered. I just yelled, "Aldo!" And he just kind of like stops, you know. When I use my dad voice, he knows when I'm using my dad voice. And he just stops and he kind of sits on the pavement and looks at me like I'm doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. And now that was a warning to him. And it was really harsh. And it was loud. And he thought I was mad at him. And how often, parents, have you yelled at your kids in order to warn them? Not because you don't love them, but because you're trying to protect them, but because you're trying to save them from impending disaster, right? That's how warnings function. I warned Aldo not to run into the street because that's where he was headed, because I love my dog. You warn your kids of impending disaster, not because you hate them, but because you love them. John is compelled to write because the threat of divine judgment is real. And he's able to write because the hope of averting this judgment is also real. This is a warning. Get ready, people. Don't you understand how serious this is?
When the evil speaks of what they say is the truth, and then God here says, this is the real truth. Make your decision.
Right.
Wisely. And like you said, it is of love, not
Right.
Not guilt, but
Compassion.
compassion. Listen to the real truth.
Right.
They've told you all this stuff, but this is what's really
Right.
true.
And what we read about in chapter 13 is that the beasts, they mirror the Christ. They try to make their message sound like the message of Christ, so that it's the Satan is called the deceiver, so that it's hard to know the truth from the lie. So exactly right. So how do we respond to these really dark words, these really challenging words of God's wrath that is going to be poured unmixed? Well, we read this as a warning, a compassionate warning. John is saying, hey, there's hope. You don't have to participate in this divine judgment. There's a way out of this. Let me warn you about it because God loves you. And then in verse 12, lest we think that this is all doom and gloom, what's the point of this? In verse 12, what does John write? What is the point of this chapter? Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, to encourage endurance among the saints. Those who are the saints? Those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to faith in Jesus, the faithful. Saints here is not just those martyrs. The saints are you and I. The saints are those who hold to the faith. And I heard a voice from heaven. Whose voice is this? The Spirit. Here we hear described explicitly the voice of the Spirit saying, write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Again, we've just read this really dark and heavy stuff. And now verses 12 and 13 call for endurance and call for hope. Lest we think that all is despair, John gives us a breath. John says, listen, even, the Spirit says through John, even if you are killed because of your faithfulness, you will have rest because your deeds follow you. So this is a word of hope in the midst of some really challenging words. Continuing on, then I looked. There was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man with a golden crown on his head. You know those images we have of heaven, these fluffy clouds, people sitting on these clouds. I think this is where we get it, but it's not a literal image. Who is this one? Who is this one? Like a Son of Man with a crown on his head? This is Christ. I mean, that's what you would presume, right? We're reading about this one seated on a cloud like a Son of Man. With what? With a sickle. What is a sickle used for?
Swiping.
What's that? Swiping, for harvesting, for reaping, to harvest and to cut down. Now, the only argument against this being Christ is that in verse 15, another angel came out of the temple calling to the one who sat on the cloud, saying to use your sickle. This could just be an announcement that judgment is coming. This could just be an announcement that the sickle is going to be used. But who is it that carries the sickle? Here we read the one who was like a Son of Man. Christ, evidently, is the one who holds the sickle. Another angel will come out to announce the coming reaping. But we see these two people carrying sickles. The first is evidently Christ, one like the Son of Man. And who will he reap? This is the reaping of the faithful. What we read in verses 15 and 16, 14 through 16, is the reaping of the faithful. This is a good harvest. Verses 17 through 20, who holds the sickle there?
There's another.
Another angel. So carrying what? A sickle. And what is happening in verses 17 through 20? The grapes that will be crushed. This is the judgment. This is both judgment. One is judgment for good. One is judgment for condemnation. One is judgment for bad. So who carries who judges? Well, we see that it's the Son of Man. But then the angels call for the reaping and the harvesting and the cutting down. So another angel came out of the temple, verse 15, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. This is judgment. What do we think of when we hear of judgment? When you hear of judgment, what do you think of? Punishment. Condemnation. Right? But what is this? A gathering. Judgment is not always and only negative. This is a very positive judgment. What is this reaping of the harvest of the earth? This is the gathering of the faithful. This is the positive side of judgment. You remember the parable that Jesus talked about, the wheat and the tares. The faithful are described time and again as the wheat, the good harvest. And so here we have someone uses a sickle to harvest the wheat, presumably. So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. This is the gathering of the faithful, and this is the good judgment. This is a positive judgment. But then we come to 17 through 20. And what is 17 through 20? This is the negative side of judgment. Another sickle used for alternative purposes. Then another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle. Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. Man, this is heavy stuff. Now, I'm not a farmer. You know this about me, I think. If you look over in my backyard, you'll see a poor attempt at a garden that's filled with more weeds than actual fruit. So I'm not a farmer, but I don't really think you use a sickle to harvest grapes. You can use a short sickle to harvest grapes?
The sickle is short, it's the side that's long.
Right, right. So, but it seems to me like you would use a sickle more to cut down the vines than to like harvest the grapes necessarily.
Well, you can cut it at the end of the bunch, you got the bunches at the end, I mean, the tip of it, you cut there.
Right.
From what I've seen.
Make sure it's sharp.
Make sure it's sharp. Well, that's what we read here. It's a sharp sickle. But evidently it cuts down the whole thing. And they're thrown into what? A vat, a great wine press. Here the image of pressing grapes is not positive. There are times when grapes are used in positive imagery in Scripture, but here it's not. Just as the redeemed in 14:4 are the first fruits of the people of God, who are then harvested in 14 through 16, the wicked, who made the earth drink the wine of Babylon's wrath in 14:8, now serve as the vintage that is trampled out by God's wrath in 14:17 through 20. So do you remember when we were talking about Babylon? We talked about the faithful were the first fruits, and then Babylon made the whole earth drink of the wine of her wrath. So we had these two categories that were set up. The first fruits, the faithful. Those who drunk the wine, the unfaithful. Then when we get to verses 14 through 20, how do we have these two categories? The first fruits are now harvested. This positive judgment. And then those who drunk the wine are now those who are put into the great wine press. So these two categories are existing. And once again, we see you cannot worship the lamb and the beast. Those are incompatible realities. And the wine press was trodden outside of the city, and blood flowed from the wine press. So this is pretty graphic language here. And scholars are kind of ambivalent about why it's outside of the city, but one of the things you can't not hear is Christ. Because Christ was crucified where? Outside of the city. So, and what happened when Christ was crucified? What did the guard do? Stuck him in the side, and what happened? Blood and water flowed. So perhaps, some have said, perhaps this is poetic justice. That Christ was crucified outside of the city where blood flowed. Now, the judgment of God comes, and they're taken outside of the city, and blood flows. But not a little bit of blood. A lot of blood.
Also could represent, in Bible times when they did the sacrifices, the bad stuff was taken outside of the city because it
Right.
belonged good and should not be in there before it was destroyed.
Right. So this could also just be recognizing where death happens outside of the city. It could recognize that those outside of the city are the unfaithful. So there's a lot of different ways in which this imagery could be applied. So yes, I think you're absolutely right there. So again, in our last 4 minutes, this is a heavy chapter. There's some really heavy stuff. We read about God's wrath. We read about God's judgment, both positively and negatively. Why do we read of this judgment? As a warning. As a warning, not out of vindictiveness, but why? Out of love. As a parent would love her child. As a parent would warn her child of impending disaster. In this chapter, readers are confronted with two possibilities. The hope of salvation that is represented by the grain harvest, and then the threat of judgment that is represented by the trampling of the grapes. And as we saw last chapter with the beasts, readers may be lulled into believing that evil is invincible, or perhaps not evil at all, and that godliness brings only loss. But John challenges this perception by pointing to the end of the story, in which earthly conditions are reversed, and the faithful are gathered together, while the wicked are trodden down. This is a great promise for the faithful. And if you are living in Asia Minor, where Christians are being killed and tortured and maimed because of their faith, this is a reversal. In the end, what happens? The faithful are not the ones who are trodden down. Lest you think that being a Christ follower means that for eternity you are going to be killed and crucified, there's an eternal hope. We read this is an eternal gospel. So remember the intended audience, those churches in Asia Minor, who would have been brought up in a culture of polytheism, would have been brought up and saying, oh, it's all right to worship multiple gods. It's all right to do this because by doing that, you can perhaps increase your economic status within society. But John is saying, no, there's this singular faithfulness. You cannot worship the Lamb and the beast. As we said this morning, it's never God and. But then he's also saying to a people who have been persecuted and even executed, especially under Nero 666, he's saying there is an eternal hope. There's something so great because in the end, there's this great reversal. The faithful are gathered up. The faithful inherit the earth, and the unfaithful, the wicked, those are the ones who will be trodden down. So for those living in persecution, this is a great story of hope. Not because God is vindictive or mean, but because God is loving and compassionate. And who is this gospel for? Remember what we read earlier in the chapter. Everyone. For everyone who lives on the earth, and for anyone who has ever lived on the earth. So this is a great hope of redemption. But recognizing that God is love and compassion, and that there will be a time when God will separate the wheat from the tares.
And it could be that the only wickedness of some people is not believing God. Not
Right.
that they have to be murderers or adulterers or other things, but that they reject God. For some, that might be their only wickedness.
Right. So this is chapter 14. And it's a hard chapter, but it's a good chapter. Any final thoughts before we close our time tonight?